Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for November 29th, 2021. I have two topics of the strategic sort that I want to bring up today, which are examples of the absurd activity of the war hawks in the transatlantic region, which are attempting to create new crises at a point in which we have a plethora of crises, ranging from the COVID pandemic to the hyperinflation, the economic situation, the phony climate change policy, which would destroy our energy system. But I want to focus on these two strategic issues today because they do represent situations which could be resolved if Washington were not committed, and the City of London and NATO were not committed to provocations and war. First, let's take up the situation with Afghanistan. There was an open letter sent by the acting foreign minister of Afghanistan, Mutaki, to the U.S. Congress, in which he asks for the United States to unfreeze the assets of the Afghan government, which are being held in banks and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury in the United States. This is over $9 billion at a point at which the people of Afghanistan are facing massive problems from food insecurity, scarcity, advances of hunger. There already are children starving to death, the lack of medication, medical supplies, the lack of warm clothing, the lack of fuel. The situation is verging on a complete catastrophe. Now, beyond the $9 billion, which actually belongs to the Afghan people, the question is, what about a reconstruction policy, not just humanitarian aid, but reconstruction policy? Well, in his open letter, this acting foreign minister of the Taliban basically says that, look, if you look at the Doha negotiations, these were done in good faith over a long period of time, and an agreement was reached in February 2020, even at the time at which a war was still continuing. The situation has changed, he goes on to say, that there's no longer direct military confrontation. The withholding of funds does not address the problems with Afghanistan, and because the immediate problem is the danger of mass death. He goes on to say that this could lead to mass migration. Among the other problems, and of course unspoken in this letter, is if Afghanistan has no access to credit or money, you could end up with a new expansion of opium production and possibly a dissolution of the government, which would open the doors for the terrorists, the ISIS group and others, to set up bases in Afghanistan from which to attack the West. Now, he writes at the end of the letter of the unique opening Afghanistan now has to develop, and welcomes trade and investment with all nations, including the United States. By unique opening, this, to me, is very clearly represented by what Helga Zepp LaRouche initiated with the adoption or the promotion of the idea of Operation Ibn Sina, named after a famous physician, medical writer, philosopher, Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, from the 11th century AD, who was very prominent and probably comes from Afghanistan. But the idea is to provide the humanitarian aid in terms of medical help, in terms of food distribution, that can give Afghanistan and its people an opportunity to emerge from 40 years of war, much of which is the United States is responsible for, that we could make a gesture of goodwill, especially through collaboration with other nations, the neighbors of Afghanistan, Russia, India, China, Pakistan. Those four countries, the US, Russia, China, and Pakistan, are part of what's called the extended troika. Also, the Indian government just agreed to ship a large quantity of wheat to Afghanistan, and the Pakistani government changed its usual policy and allowed the Indians to ship it through Pakistan. So we're seeing this potential for cooperation. how would it hurt the United States to free the assets that are still being held in American banks? This is a no-brainer, and this is something that we should fight for and make it connected to this idea of Operation Ibn Sina as a way of showing that the world will not allow indifference to the suffering of people who have been victimized by wars that were not of their own making. So that's one of the strategic issues I wanted to address. The other one has to do with the continued nonsense coming from the State Department and U.S. sources and NATO sources about Ukraine. The idea that the Russians are amassing large numbers of troops on the Ukrainian border, that there's a commitment to invade Ukraine. Some people even say by the end of January or February they expect Russian troops to overrun Ukraine. This was addressed by Sergei Naryshkin, who's the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. And he said he called the warnings of a Russian invasion, quote, malicious propaganda operation coming from the U.S. Department of State, unquote. And in fact, this is what the State Department has repeatedly insisted, that Russia is preparing for an invasion. They talk about 90 or 100,000 troops massed at the border. This is very similar to Colin Powell's description of taco trucks in the Iraqi desert as chemical weapons laboratories. It's a complete fabrication from the intelligence community. What Naryshkin says is that the goal of this propaganda campaign is to embolden the government in Kiev, which is quite weak and really out of control, to escalate, pushing them to attack the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, which is largely made up of ethnic Russians. Now, what Naryshkin said is that this is a threat to Ukraine, because there will be consequences if they escalate. But their view is that unless there's more threat from Russia, Ukraine will not be brought into NATO, and therefore building up this threat, hyping it, and possibly launching some kind of escalation that would lead to a Russian response would be the way to get the U.S. and NATO to come into Ukraine and join them and bail them out. Now, the problem is Ukraine has refused to abide by the agreements that were made by the Normandy format and also in the Minsk Accords. They're not providing for a basis for autonomy for the people of eastern Ukraine. And they refuse to negotiate with the Russians. And at the same time, the Biden administration is going head over heels, promising weapons, promising support, saying, don't worry, we're with you 100%. But Naryshkin made the point that the West will not come in to protect Ukraine if such actions are taken. For his part, he said Russia should, quote, remain calm and reinforce their country's defensive capability, unquote. Of course, by doing that, they'll be accused of being in a preparation for war. This is where you see the problem we have with the neocon establishment in the West. The idea that the West, especially the United States and NATO and the United Kingdom, have a unilateral right to determine issues of war and peace. And it's that same establishment which is pushing for the Great Reset to give total economic power to the central banks. And the same grouping which is behind the Green New Deal, which is aimed at making efficient energy no longer available. Part of that can be seen in the efforts to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which hasn't been opened yet because of refusal to accredit it by the European Union and Germany, at a point at which people in this part of the world are suffering the consequences of a cold early winter and a lack of affordable electricity. Utility bills are going up 40% between November and December in Germany. So again, who benefits from these policies? Not the people of Germany or Ukraine, certainly not the Russian people, certainly not the American people. The people who benefit are those of the military-industrial complex, whose future security and prosperity depends on convincing you we have to go to war to defend our freedoms from the aggressive and malicious intents of Putin and Xi Jinping. So just be careful when you hear these things and recognize that there's another side to the story, and the people who are telling you about the Russian threat are the same people who hyped the threat from Saddam Hussein, who hyped the threat from the Syrian government of Assad, and who consistently will tell you that we're about to be attacked by terrorists and overrun by immigrants, when in fact it's our policies that are producing the terrorists and producing the immigrants. So thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.